Sorry.
Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought I heard somebody interrupting me. Okay. The name of this panel is Access and Inclusion in Smart Cities. And let me introduce the panel to you. So today, and I'm just going to go by the order that we are speaking in. So James Thurston is joining us, and he's with G3ICT. Ivo Brandon Brand is joining us from Huawei. Lori Golden is joining us from Ernst & Young, and Darren Rowan is joining us from Eli Lilly. So what I want to do is I'm going to give a brief introduction of myself, and then I'm going to turn it over to the panelists and ask them to give a brief introduction of themselves as well. But I'm very proud to be a partner with Open Business Council, and really appreciate Dennis and his amazing team and everything they've done to pull this conference together. It is not a small feat to pull all these speakers together over 3 days. And so we're really, really proud to be part of this. I'm the CEO of Rue Global Impact, and we focus on working with global corporations to make sure they are meaningfully included people with disabilities in their workforce as customers. And also we're very focused on humanizing technology, making sure that technology is for everyone, and smart cities, very important part of this conversation. Last thing, I am the chairman of Billion Strong, which is a nonprofit that we're building right now to focus on identity and empowerment for the community of people with disabilities. So thank you so much. James, let me turn it over to you so you can tell the audience who you are.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Debra. It's wonderful to be here as part of your panel. I always love working with you and with these other great speakers and organizations. I'm James Thurston. I'm Vice President of an international nonprofit organization called G3ICT, or the Global Initiative for Inclusive ICTs. We were created with support of the United Nations about 15 years ago, specifically to focus on the digital inclusion and human rights of the more than 1 billion people with disabilities around the world. We do that in a whole bunch of ways. We run one of the largest technology and disability conferences every year. We run the International Professional Society for accessibility professionals. But we also run a lot of initiatives, and the one I'll be speaking about or drawing on the most today for this discussion will be our Global Smart Cities for All initiative, which is looking at and working with cities around the world on being both smarter and more inclusive at the same time. Thanks, Debra.
Awesome. Is that me next?
Sorry, it helps to unmute. We're gonna go with Lori next. Sorry about that.
Hello, I'm Lori Golden. I'm with EY, which is a global consulting, advisory, tax advisory, accounting firm with almost 300,000 people around the world. And I have the privilege of spending my days thinking about how we bring people with diverse abilities into the organization and how we create an environment that enables all our people to be comfortable, do their best work, and how we foster a culture that feels truly inclusive and welcoming, so that everybody can reach their full potential. And that means I work across the organization with all our infrastructure groups, with all our lines of business to embed inclusiveness and accessibility into all our processes.
Yes, they do amazing work. Thank you, Lori. Darren, let's go to you next. And Darren, you are like me. You forgot to go off mute.
Oh, okay. Says I'm not on mute.
Yes, you're good now.
Okay, thanks. So yes, my name is Darren Rowan. I work for Eli Lilly and Company, which is a global pharmaceuticals and healthcare company. I'm based in the UK. My day job, if you like, is as a program manager in the IT organization of the company. But in the last 5 years, I've been involved in, first of all, leading an employee resource group, which covers pretty much all the countries we have a presence in outside of North America. And also, I lead the global accessibility strategy that we launched at the start of 2020.
Thank you, Darren. And last but not least, Ivo.
Thank you, Deborah. So my name is Ivo. I work at Huawei Consumer Business Group, also based in the UK, in London. And I lead a number of AI innovation projects that focus on making the world a better, more inclusive place.
Thank you. And sorry to change your name. I guess you want to go with Ivo instead of Eva. I mean, Eva.
Either is fine for me.
All right. So let's begin. And we're going to begin with James. Since James is focused on this from sort of a nonprofit foundation of really making sure that all over the world, we are making sure that smart cities are accessible. So James, there's a lot of definitions of smart city, but based on G3ICT's work, worldwide with cities, how do you define an inclusive smart city?
Good question, Debra, and you're exactly right. I think there are about as many definitions of smart city as there are smart cities around the world. To start with, I think we often sort of look at the definition by the Smart City Council that smart cities, I think it's something like are using ICTs to promote livability, workability, and sustainability of the cities. What we do on top of that is sort of add an accessibility and digital inclusion lens to that. So if we're looking at technology as the backbone of a smart city and data as the lifeblood of a smart city, how are technology and data, as a city is becoming smarter, as that city is using technology and data, how are they supporting greater inclusion of people with disabilities? And it's important to ask that question and sort of approach it with that sort of definition, because we know that around the world there's at least 1 billion people with disabilities, about 15% of the population of the world, of your city, of your company. We also know that about 70% of disabilities are not visible to the eye. So you're not going to know that a person necessarily in your city, in your company, in your organization is a person with a disability. And then beyond that, and one of the reasons why we focus on this defining an inclusive smart city is that we also know that outcomes for people with disabilities need to be improved. People with disabilities are less likely to start school, they're less likely to finish school, they're more likely to be unemployed, they're more likely to be in poverty. And so as we're seeing the digital transformation of cities, which we are, and it's very exciting. I come from the technology industry, although I'm in a nonprofit now. That use of technology by cities to support the broad range of services that we all rely on in our cities. I live in Washington, D.C., so services like transportation, public safety, education, healthcare, emergency preparedness and response, living in the middle of a pandemic. Increasingly, cities are using technology to support all those cities. But we also know that increasingly, those technology deployments, those smart solutions are actually making the digital divide worse, not better for people with disabilities, because those deployments of technology are not accessible, they're not inclusive. Let me give you some examples. I live in Washington, D.C. One of the first things I do over the past year is every day check our city's smart solution. They have a data dashboard on COVID. What's the hospitalization rate? How many ICU beds are open? What's the percentage of people that are getting their vaccinations? All really important data that I check. That website's not accessible if you're a blind person. It's not usable with a screen reader. That's a really important example. Another example that I just read about, I think actually from a colleague of yours, Debra, in Australia, the website to sign up and schedule your vaccination appointment, not accessible to people with visual disabilities. So critical kinds of services and information that could be accessible but aren't, because of the way that the cities are designing and deploying these. And there's lots of examples of that. You could think of digital payment systems, which a lot of smart cities are using. And maybe those payment systems time out too quickly for someone with a cognitive disability or an older person. Mobility as a service, transportation planning apps and solutions. Again, really exciting. People use them every day. But is the critical graphical information, maps and schedules, presented in a way that's accessible? So defining what an inclusive smart city means, thinking about these exciting smart solutions, these exciting technology deployments, but thinking about them in a way that ensures that they really do work for everyone. And one of the things that I'll talk about in a bit, perhaps, is we've actually come up with a very clear definition of what an inclusive smart city is. We've defined 18 different capabilities that every smart city needs to adopt to be both more inclusive and smarter at the same time. And that includes things like how the city uses global accessibility standards. It includes things like the leadership's commitment to disability and inclusion, including in technology. It includes the systems that the city has in place, both to understand whether or not its technology deployments are accessible, and then importantly, what does it do to fix them when they're not. So there are ways to define what an accessible and inclusive smart city is. And where we're at now is sort of raising awareness among cities around the world to adopt these capabilities, build these capabilities in their own city. Thanks, Debra.
Yeah, very well said, James. And I hope that every smart city initiative adopts those 18 points. And so that's one reason why we definitely wanted James here. Also, we're going to go to Lori next, but I want to make a comment. During COVID-19, when everybody went home to stay safe, shelter in place, that's when we started realizing that when things are accessible, everybody benefits. When things are inaccessible, people with disabilities are not the only ones that don't get access. So it's very important that we consider all human beings. So Lori, how can smart cities impact business?
Well, James just touched on so many ways that accessible smart cities, inclusive smart city design, can enable people with disabilities to be independent and to do more. And that impacts friends and families. So if apps are available to let people know what transportation is accessible and when that transportation has a glitch and what the workaround for that glitch is, people are better able to plan. And that's not just the individual with disabilities, that's everybody, as you know well, Debra, in that person's network, in the friendship group, in the family, to be able to plan to get out to restaurants, to go shopping, to go to cultural institutions and just take part in life. And that means a larger consumer base. That means more foot traffic, so to speak. I have a friend who is a wheelchair user, and was meeting him for lunch. I chose the place for lunch. I looked on Yelp to choose a restaurant. It's not a city I was very familiar with. And we ended up getting there, and I was so embarrassed. There were huge steps to get into this. It was a little hole-in-the-wall place. Perhaps I should have known better and not chosen a hole-in-the-wall place. But had I been able to check that out beforehand, to check out the accessibility, I would have saved us a lot of time and myself a lot of embarrassment. And we were restricted. We went down the street looking for restaurants that were easy for us to get into. We would have had a lot more opportunities, and we would have been a more powerful consumer group had we had the advantage of apps to tell us where to go. Also, companies will have access to a broader talent pool. We talk about people with disabilities being an under-leveraged pool of talent for all kinds of work, but I know in one major city, about half the job seekers that go to that city's office of disabilities for help with job placement do not have internet access or cannot access the internet due to the inaccessibility of their systems. And if that digital divide were eased, if those individuals had access, they could look for jobs online, apply online. There's almost nothing you can do today without having internet accessibility, and we all know that that's a big issue. We would also have people with disabilities who are able to get to work more easily. I have a friend, again, with a mobility issue, someone else entirely, who routinely, and she depends on mass transportation, routinely is late to work by hours because she does not know when the elevators are broken and when she's got to go to another stop or take a bus or take paratransit and use another system entirely. And it can hang her up for up to half a day. And that affects her productivity. And that will make it harder to hire individuals who are totally dependent on systems that not only can they not control, but they don't have good information on.
Yes, very well said. And, you know, Lori brings up some really good points. For example, there are 330 million people in the United States, but 163 million of them, including myself, unfortunately, we don't have access to high-speed internet. That's more than 50% of the United States. We do not have access. And yet, we know companies that could actually bring us access, but we're fighting with them. But so there is so much that needs to be done to make sure that people have access. And I also want to point out, Lori gave us some really great examples of how inaccessible venues impact us, but don't think that we're talking about those people with disabilities, because the reality is we are human beings and we all will experience disabilities in some way in our life. And it doesn't mean you're broken. It just means that you are human. So let's go on. But thank you, Lori. Great points. Darren, I know you are actually a person with disabilities. What excites you, but also what concerns you about smart cities? Darren, you were muted, so I don't know if you've muted it or.
Why it keeps muting on me?
Yeah, I think that the system is muting you, so apologies. But go ahead, Darren.
Okay, that's no worries. Yeah, so just so everybody knows, I'm visually impaired. I'm registered blind or legally blind, as they say in some countries. I guess what excites me around venturing into cities, because I have to say I don't live in a city, you know, but I do, or I did regularly visit cities both for work and for pleasure. I think there's a couple of things that immediately spring to mind. I think that the fact that you should enable people's greater independence, right? I mean, a couple of things that people with disabilities want is equal access and as much independence as they can get. And so through the use of technology, and I can see the things like getting around a city with transport. I mean, I can't wait to be able to step into one of these self-driving cars. I can assure you I've got no fears about getting in the back of one of those and actually have something that feeds back to me and tells me what's going on around me. And rather than sitting there worrying, thinking, does the driver actually know where I'm going here? So I think getting around the cities themselves, I think I welcome, you know, more and more beacons, not only to be able to use the navigation systems that I use on my iPhone, but also, you know, getting into the actual buildings and having beacons in buildings as well, and particularly on things like underground systems and metros, where I would tend to avoid those unless it was with somebody else, because they're just you know, a tunnel that leads me into so many different places that I can get easily lost if I'm unfamiliar. So I think that enabling that level of independence is absolutely key to not only myself, but thousands and thousands of other people. I'd also welcome the idea of smart food, if anybody wants to come up with that concept as well. When you go into these restaurants and conferences where there's a buffet there, if something could tell me that I'm a vegetarian sandwich, that would be quite useful as well. But that's a little bit of an innovation idea. I think what concerns me is this kind of idea where we get more and more of this, and airports are a really good example, right? Where you walk through an airport and there's so much self-service going on that is clearly inaccessible, so much of it. Lots of touch screens for everything, which I do wonder with COVID now, whether touch screens will almost become, an absolute no-no, because people have been told not to kind of be touching things and cleaning their hands, etc. So I think that there needs to be a lot of thought around that. I think one of the benefits perhaps of not, using all these touch screens in buildings or around cities could be that they would push more for people to use their own devices, which is a great thing in itself, because many people with disabilities know what assistive technology works for them on their own devices and carry them with them. But I do think that we need to make sure we get a lot of those basics right. I mean, today I even struggle being able to buy my train ticket through a mobile app because it's not accessible in the way it should be. So let's get some of those basics right for a start, before we get in sort of too clever around some of the technology that we could use in cities itself. I think the other aspect that does concern me is that I love the use of technology to enable us to be able to be, as inclusive and independent as we can be. There is a factor there, though, as well, when we start talking about the need to be efficient in cities, which tends to always get pushed into doing things faster and removing people. So there's a concern that I would have that if you have more of these things like self-service, and sometimes people just simply do need help when something doesn't work, will they be at hand? And also, will people be able to be as sociable as they can be? With more and more use of technology, and we see today that the digital age now brings less of an attention span, and sometimes people making comments behind the screen, will that transfer more into conflicts in society and in cities? I don't know. It's a big question, but it does have a little bit of a concern for me.
Yeah, great points, Darren. Great points. And I really like the point where you said, let's get the access right, because once again, going back to COVID, I know here in the United States, when we first went into lockdown and we're trying to educate our children, 40% of children in the United States could not access the education for a variety of reasons. Lack of bandwidth, which we've talked about. The technology is not accessible. People didn't have access to the technology. There was a lot of assumptions we were all making that we realized were wrong. So I do hope that we take these lessons learned and really make the world work for more human beings, all human beings, and at the same time protect our planet. So Ivo, I'm going to ask you the same question, if you don't mind. I know that you're looking at this from a different lens, and I appreciate the work that you're doing with Tech for All and Tech for Good, but what excites you about smart cities? Once again, the opportunities and the concerns as well.
I think, well, thank you, Debra. I mean, this is the hardest thing of being on a panel, I find, because now I just want to listen more to Darren and James and Laurie about their expertise area. I think for me, there's a couple of things also in response to what Darren said. I think for me personally, innovation, and I work for a technology company, so I'm likely to come at it from an innovation project. Innovation is essentially an idea turning into turning into something that adds value or solves a problem, right? And if that problem can lead to greater quality of life or equal access for everyone or enabling independence, then obviously in a smart city where there is greater access to technology, better connectivity, then as the optimist in the room, I think that should give us all opportunities to help us realize those things exactly that Darren mentioned. and also actually the accessibility points that James mentioned. For me, and I think this is also very Huawei, technology shouldn't replace the human. I think they should work together. I think I look at technology as something that should complement human creativity and human expertise and work together so that we have an enhanced reality that is better than the sum of all parts. And I think some of the pitfalls that Darren mentioned around losing some of the social element and losing almost putting people more into social isolation because we are replacing things with technology, I don't think that's how it should be. For me, in addition to enabling greater accessibility and equal opportunity and equal access, there is this opportunity in smart cities for game-changing innovation where we really build and take some of the bigger challenges that we face. In this case, we need smart food. How can we bring together chefs and technology experts and AI experts and whatever it takes to solve that problem? Wouldn't it be amazing if we can do that? And why couldn't we, right? We're with connectivity and data and everything. I'm sure we can figure out a way for a vegan or a vegetarian or a pescatarian sandwich to tell you what it is. So that for me is the biggest opportunity, but I do find myself being slightly romantic optimist sometimes.
Which we appreciate, though. We need hope. Well, we need hope, and sometimes hope is a beautiful thing, and it takes us to the next step. And going back, you made me think of what Darren was saying, that, you know, if you don't label these sandwiches and it's all self-service, and hopefully there's humans that want to help. Sometimes humans don't want to help, and they just consider you a pain. And that, unfortunately, is going to happen a lot when people need help. So, but I also love the point, Ivo, I really love the point that you make, that technology should enhance humanity. And I agree with you. And that's one reason why I enjoy working with you so much, because we do need to be hopeful, but we also need to really be deliberate about including humans, really including humans. Okay, let's go back to James. James, I know you've got a lot of experience in this topic, which, you know, we really appreciate, but what are some of the most inclusive smart cities that you have seen?
Sure. Thanks, Debra. So I get asked that question a lot, and there is no perfectly inclusive and smart city, just like there's probably no perfectly smart city as well. But I think one of the things that we do in the work that we're doing with cities around the world is again thinking of those 18 capabilities that are in our maturity model assessment tool. Is what are some good practices? What are some ways that cities are demonstrating those capabilities that we've determined with experts around the world are really critical to a city being both inclusive and smart at the same time. And so, and we do see some really good examples of cities, good practices and demonstrating these capabilities. So for example, in Tel Aviv, they actually train their IT department regularly on accessibility, which is critically important. I don't know a lot of, frankly, a lot of cities with big IT departments that are training their own internal staff on accessibility, but they've made that commitment and realized that it's important in the development and the deployment of their technology assets, of their smart solutions. In Chicago, they actually have an IT design guide that talks about privacy and security and the things that are important to IT deployments. But it also has a focus on inclusion and accessibility, because they see that as important as privacy and security, accessibility. And it is in terms of making sure that your technology deployments are accessible. Rio has actually done a great job of trying to make sure that its communications, information can also be accessible and made to be accessible. So they have for the city of Rio de Janeiro, a communications guide that tells anyone working for the city that's putting out public information certain standards that they use. So, you know, you have to use this logo, the logo has to go here, those sorts of things that are in how you communicate to the public. They have taken the step to build into their communications guide. This is how you make sure that whether you're doing a press release or using social media, this is how you make sure that those communications are accessible. So all city staff who are communicating to the public are able to understand how to make sure that content, often that critically important content, is accessible. And then just one more, the city of New York is actually taking steps to make sure, and this is a big one because cities spend trillions of dollars on technology. It's a gigantic market. And New York is making sure that its purchasing power is driving the market to be more accessible. So they have taken steps to make sure that in their tenders, when they're buying technology systems, services, that they only purchase accessible technology that will work for their own employees with disabilities, but also technology that will work for the general public. And just as a note on that, we're actually partnering with the World Economic Forum and the G20 Smart City Alliance to promote a policy like that, to make sure that cities around the world, that when they're investing all of their money in technology and smart solutions, which is exciting, that they're buying technology that works for everyone. So there really are some fantastic practices that can be replicated relatively easily, frankly, by cities around the world.
Very, very exciting, James. And I know that we are going to make sure that we provide a link to what G3ICT is doing so everyone has access to it. I mean, we were very deliberate who we picked for this panel. So we know there's a lot of really powerful things happening. So James, thank you so much for all your efforts. We're going to shift a little bit. We're still talking about smart cities, but we are, and we have a question here too. And I love this question, by the way. Do smart cities create social inequalities or inequities, I would also say. And that sort of leads into where we were going with the conversation anyway. So does one of the panelists want to take this? I mean, Lori, you were next. So I don't know if you would like to take that, because I was also going to ask you about how AI, artificial intelligence, that we need with smart cities can add inequities. And so it goes perfectly into the question that we just got. So Lori, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. Well, I think when we think of designing smart cities or any digital technologies, and people with disabilities, we generally think of accessibility in terms of taking the variation in people's cognitive and neurological and physical and mental health abilities into account. But in addition to that, in order to level the playing field, we need to take the difference in people's day-to-day experiences and life experiences into account. It's not just a question of being able to access, it's a question of whether the systems, whether it's a city or it's an app that uses an algorithm, has taken into account the variation in how people navigate the world and therefore live their lives and what their life journey looks like. So if you take a look at, I'm a large employer, so I'm thinking in terms of applications like recruiting. If algorithms don't take, if algorithms, and they often do, filter out people who have gaps in their resumes, as so often happens with people with disabilities, there's going to be a great inequity there. People with disabilities can acquire their disability, and that may cause a gap in a resume or a gap in education. We know that about 80% of disabilities are acquired between the ages of 18 and 64. So that's the prime higher education and prime working years. Individuals could have flare-ups of a physical condition or a mental health condition that might take them out of the workforce or cause a stoppage in their education for a while before they could go back. And so we need to be able to factor in schools and the kinds of education that people get and the kinds of work experience that people get is also greatly impacted by factors like the accessibility of a given environment, say a given school. At large employers like EY, traditionally we looked for candidates from four-year institutions and institutions that we knew well, that had the kinds of programs that produced the kinds of talent who were traditionally successful. So we looked to, in essence, replicate the most successful people in our workforce, but then we wanted them to be diverse, which doesn't really make sense. Diversity leads to diversity of abilities, just like diversity of background or culture or orientation or anything else, leads to diversity in experiences. So an individual with disabilities may need to choose an educational experience that is accessible or is more convenient, closer to home. If somebody needs help with activities of daily living and they're getting that at home, it does not make a whole lot of sense. It may not even be practical for them to consider living away from home, and that may dictate the kind of experience that they get. So in order to really plan for not just the variation in abilities, but the variation in life experiences, we clearly need to get a diversity of people involved at the beginning in everything from setting the strategy and building the standards to actually building the technologies themselves, to the training and the education of everybody who would use those technologies and who's involved in the implementation. And then, of course, to how we communicate around that, and making sure that the communications are accessible, but also inclusive and take into account that people are going to be using our technologies in different ways. So I'd say that, yeah, there is a lot of potential for inequity, not only if we don't take accessibility into consideration, but if we don't take the diversity of human experience and life experience into consideration. And the best way to do that is to have a diverse group of people involved at every stage, and in every way, in the design, the build, the implementation, the training, and the communications processes.
Excellent, excellent point, Lori. I've told this story before, but Mattel decided they were going to give Barbie artificial intelligence. And so they taught Barbie, they programmed, obviously, Barbie to answer questions. And then they showcased her at a conference. And so they had a little girl that asked Barbie a question. And so the little girl, so Barbie said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Typical question. And the little girl said, "I want to be a computer scientist." And Barbie said, "Have you thought about a career in fashion instead?" So once the women of the audience, yeah, I see you all laughing, Darren, everybody's laughing. Once the women were finished with ripping their heads off, it turned out they had a small, tiny, diverse group of males programming Barbie. If you'd had one woman, maybe a woman with a disability on there, any diversity in there. We know diversity leads to innovation. So great points. We have some wonderful questions coming up here. And sorry, the two of them passed by, so I didn't get the questions. But how can someone enjoy the benefits of smart city if it has no money to buy digital hardware and cannot follow innovation? And I think I'm going to just take that question real quick. And I think the way you do it is you work with groups like G3ICT, which is pulling us all together and working with the big groups that are making a difference. But I think you get in line and you help them so that they can make sure, because we understand that money is an issue. I mean, we see that happening all over. So let me, Darren, let me go to you and ask you a question. How do we truly embed accessibility in our physical and digital environments in a sustainable way? And we'll come back to the questions too.
Sure. Hopefully you can hear me this time.
Yes, we can.
Okay. I love that story. It's like something out of The Office TV series. So I would just kind of follow on from some of the things that Laura just said, really around, first of all, it's about not only consulting with people from all sorts of diverse backgrounds as part of your, design, planning, development, etc., but it's about employing and having people in your organization who are working alongside you, even leading these initiatives. It's great to hear James saying about these 18 capabilities, but we know ourselves that unless they're actually written in stone and they're kind of put in front of people, that's the sort of stick aspect of the carrot and stick piece that sometimes holds people to make things accessible and inclusive. But we know that still, without those things in place, there will be many people who would tend to ignore some of those guidelines unless they have other people who sit alongside them saying, I can't do this because you've now made it inaccessible, or you've done something here that's not going to work for me. I truly believe that a lot of this is around mindset, and I think the earlier that we get this into people's minds, the better. So again, Laurie talked about education, but I think also what I'd love to see is actually this sort of stuff being talked about in secondary schools and upwards. I've got 2 children at secondary school, and I keep asking them, why are they talking about accessibility in your IT classes? And, why don't they talk about it in your design classes and things like that? And, bothering my kids when I should be bothering the teachers. But I do think that it's important, though, because the earlier you talk about it, and we know people go to college and do, courses on computer science, and still they don't talk about accessibility and inclusive design until perhaps they come to a company like ours or others that are on this panel. So I think that there's some of the things that you need to try and get into the people that are working with you. Obviously, some of the sort of standards are really important to have there. And I think one other thing I would say is in the sort of 3 or 4 years that I've been really involved in the accessibility and disability community, which is full of people who are willing to share, that's one of the big things I've found, is that there's so much out there. It would almost be nice to be able to bring that in to some sort of like knowledge base, really, that's just easier than one place you can go and get those things. And that's easier said than done. But something that helps people who are new to this game, or even those who are doing this for years now, can go and find the latest kind of findings very easily at their fingertips to make it as easy as possible to kind of make this sustainable.
Excellent points, Darren. We have all these wonderful questions, but before we go to the questions, Ivo, do you mind just talking a little bit about some of the artificial intelligence apps that have been created by Huawei to support our community of people with disabilities? And then we're going to go to these amazing questions.
Yes, no problem, Deborah. Yes, I'm very happy to talk about, especially StorySign, because it's sort of my baby. And I will try to keep it brief and not go into a wild 60-minute rant about how amazing it is. But well, essentially, I think some of the things that were said on this panel is there is no point in having a smart city if it's only smart for half of the people, right? So I think it's really, really important that we somehow bridge this digital divide and make everything accessible and available to everyone and give everyone equal opportunity and accessibility. And one of the things that we did to do a tiny, tiny piece of that puzzle is we used our AI to create a free mobile app that helps deaf children learn to read. Because obviously deaf children can't learn to read phonetically like their hearing peers. And as a result, often struggle to learn to read or learn to read much later in life. And what we did is we used our technology to power an avatar, a 3D avatar in an app, to translate a number of popular children's books to sign language. So you simply hover your phone over the book. You can hold the physical copy of the book. You hover your phone over it. The camera detects the language, and serves you up the 3D avatar, who then translates that to a local sign language. So in America it would be American Sign Language, in the UK it would be British Sign Language, etc. And the nicest thing, personally, I think, of that experience is every word that's being signed is being highlighted on the app, because the syntax structure of sign language is very different to a spoken language. So it also helps not just the children to make the match between the written word, the sign language, and the meaning, which helps them ultimately learn to read. It also enables them to read together with their parents, who in 90% of the cases aren't deaf and do not master sign language, maybe to the level of proficiency that they want to, or a grandmother or a sibling or a friend. So it doesn't just help deaf children learn to read, it also brings people closer together in quite a meaningful experience of reading with children. And I think that's a really, well, first of all, it's a privilege to be working on something that really makes a tangible difference, albeit tiny. I think that's a really nice example of what I talked about earlier, how human creativity and human problem solving together with advancing technology can make a difference to ultimately lead to more inclusivity. But obviously we need to do so much more to overcome all of those hurdles around accessibility, et cetera, because if we need to have a base level where most experiences or all experiences are available to everyone, I think.
Yeah, well said. And it is a loved app too. How many, do you have stats on how many times it's been downloaded? It's just surprising to me.
Well, I think more interesting than the downloads, because it's obviously for a very niche audience, because you need to have a young deaf child. At one point, I think 40% of all the users were active daily users.
Wow.
So that suggests that everyone who downloaded it actually used it. I mean, the tricky thing is, ideally, you would have a great wealth of, an endless wealth of children's books in there. And we only have 71 books, which is a good place to start, from 15 different sign languages. And it's available on all modern smartphones, including iOS and Android and Huawei. Just to put that in there. Speaking of inclusivity, by the way, because we obviously have our own smartphones, but we purposely made the phone available for everyone, everywhere. That was a key point, because otherwise it's a bit pointless.
Yeah, it is a great point though, because if you only build something for iOS or Android, you're leaving out large groups of people. There's so many ways that we can discriminate against people. Okay, James, we're going to go back to you. We're going to ask you the hard questions. Ready? Okay, because we have some wonderful questions. Inclusion becomes integral to urban centers, extending to smart city programs. And how can technology better enable inclusion across city services, public engagement, and economic opportunities? Great question.
Fantastic question. I saw that one. I'm glad you grabbed that one, Deborah. Not surprised. It also allows me to sort of play off of what Ivo and Lori were talking about in innovation. I've talked a little bit about making sure that your mainstream smart solutions that a city is deploying are accessible. But another way that we approach inclusive smart cities is this innovation angle. And can we be leveraging data and leading edge technologies like AI and machine learning to solve long-standing inclusion challenges for people with disabilities in urban environments? The number one problem I hear from commissioners of disabilities of cities around the world has nothing to do on the face of it with technology. It is, James, we wish we could get a handle on the accessibility of our sidewalks. New York City has 13,000 miles of sidewalk. At any given moment on any given day, some of it is accessible to people with disabilities and much of it's not. How do we get a handle on that so that we can prioritize and repair? And you can use data and technology to do that. So we've just launched a project with the University of Washington and with Microsoft to work with 5 cities in Latin America to use different streams of data and use AI to then create information that's available to anybody to help them create their own personal preference for the accessibility of a sidewalk. So a person with a wheelchair, for example, they may be only able to use a sidewalk if it's less than an 8-degree incline. Or they won't be able to use a sidewalk if there's a very high curb defined in whatever the measurement is, inches or. So there's all these different characteristics of sidewalks that can be made available to people to plan where they want to live, where they want to shop, work, just how they want to get around the city by using artificial intelligence and taking all these streams of data, standardizing them, and then redeploying them through an app that allows people to tackle what is, again, as I mentioned, the #1 problem I hear, which is sidewalks. So and if you open up those sidewalks, and I know everyone on this panel this will resonate with, then you open up the economic opportunity. I mentioned at the beginning that people with disabilities have worse outcomes in general in every country than the rest of the population. Education, employment, poverty. If you can make the city more accessible from a mobility perspective, then you can allow for people with disabilities to get to school, get to work, and be integrated into the life of the city. So the innovation piece is really critical and exciting.
Yes, and so sorry about that. I accidentally disconnected myself. Darn it. So sorry about that. So Lori, we're going to go to you next. And I know you know the question, but when I accidentally kicked myself out, I lost the question. So I'm going to just turn it over to you.
So the question was around understanding the people that are going to live in a smart city, what their priorities and problems are, and the need to be very intentional around how we deploy those communities. And, you know, it's actually more of a comment and a fantastic one. If cities are going to work for everybody, then everybody needs to be involved in the planning and needs to be considered at the get-go. And many of you know the saying in the disabilities community, nothing about us without us. So the way to include people with disabilities is to have people with disabilities who can bring their life experiences and their stories and the ways in which, I'm saying they, but it's we, I'm a person with disabilities too, although non-visible, needs to navigate the world day to day. And if we are involved at the beginning as individuals, teams, and as communities, as constituency groups, giving input, then that's the best way to make sure that not only the accessibility is there, but how that accessibility will be deployed, how it will be used in somebody's day-to-day experience. And it's absolutely critical. And it goes back to the basics of having people with disabilities involved in setting the agenda and the priorities, in the design, in the implementation, in the communications, and part of the teams and part of the workforces that are creating all this.
Yeah, very, very well said. And I know that we only have about 7 minutes left, and there's just some great comments. I love this question. Is it possible for smart city technology innovations to be focused towards generating free, sustainable energy for urban cities? I think that's a wonderful idea, and I think technology definitely could do it. But I don't know that, that's something that this panel, unless James knows that answer. But I would love that. That's such a great idea. But I want to use our time wisely. So we only have about 7 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is I would just like to turn it over to our panelists to make some short comments before we end. And so, Darren, let me start with you. I'll do Darren, Ivo, and then Lori and James. I'll do, since Lori and James had just finished speaking. So, Darren, let me turn the floor over to you.
Just to give my final views on smart cities and artificial intelligence.
Yes, please.
I think, I mean, what we're hearing constantly is about, having people who are going to provide input, who've actually got those experiences, right? That seems to be the number one thing that keeps coming across to me. Like I said, having the standards, it is one thing, but actually having people telling you about their lived experience, and we found in Lilly, and it wouldn't be a surprise to many other organizations, that the true impact happens when people tell their stories, right? And I think that when we think about the good things around smart cities, we need to really understand that full journey. And I don't just mean that going into the city, but the journey of that person, whether they are a visitor or the person who lives in that city, and you know, from the disability angle as well, around right from the education through to the transport, through to the workplace and socialization, etc., all those things. And it's all around the kind of big picture thinking in terms of, you know, as well as having a city that is obviously focused on being effective for the people, it's also really important for people to feel that they can be who they want to be. They can feel that they can get access to what they need to get access to. They can be as independent as they can be, and they can feel safe, right? I mean, back to the sidewalk thing, it's not just about feeling like you've got the space, the place to walk, but actually that you feel safe in the environment that you live and work in.
Yeah, well said, Darren. Ivo?
I'll be very quick, conscious of time. I think smart cities offer us an opportunity to use technology to create a new normal in which everyone has access to everything all the time. And step by step, we should work on improving the pavements and smart food and go through that journey, like Darren says, and just solve little problems step by step by step to essentially make a better, all-inclusive future.
I agree. And one more comment I want to make before I give it to James. Please include people with disabilities in everything you're doing, but make sure that they are qualified to be included, because don't just go on the street and find somebody random and they're blind. Yay. Make sure they actually have the background and the experience to answer the questions for our community. James?
I'm going to use my closing remarks just to answer one question briefly that has come up a few times, but also I really want to emphasize what Darren and Lori have been speaking about in a really compelling way about inclusion and diversity. I mentioned these 18 capabilities that we think define an inclusive smart city. One of them is culture of diversity. Is that city hiring people with disabilities, and is it training its entire staff on disability and accessibility? And to the question that's come up a few times about, well, is this just a rich city, a global north sort of developed economy issue? No, it's not. We let cities self-define. If they have an app or a website and they want to call themselves a smart city, fantastic. Just make sure it's accessible. And keep in mind that the pioneer in digital payments came from Kenya. They have deployed M-Pesa across the country, and it's largely accessible. And they were doing that long before any country or city in the global north, at least at scale. So it's not necessarily a developed versus developing economy issue.
Yes, yes. And love Hilton's comment. There is a great smart city panel. I agree. These people are amazing. Where accessibility and inclusion is paramount. Lori, you have the last few minutes.
I'd say in some, and this is a little bit of a divergence, but it's an overarching comment. This is not about a binary of thinking about the needs of people with disabilities as a special group. Disabilities are a natural variation in human experience. Disabilities affect all of us at some point in our lives. And this is about harnessing the talents and the energies of every human being. And it is costly for cities, for societies, and for our world to exclude or only partially include some people. So this isn't just about justice. This isn't just about equity. This is about productivity and smooth functioning. This is about peace for everybody. And this is not about some of us. This is about all of us.
Well said, Lori. Well said. Well, thank you to this amazing panel. I mean, we've sent the information that James provided to us. These Darren, Ivo, Lori, James, amazing speakers available to help, to participate, to support what you're doing. And it's going to take all of us to do it. But I believe the world is going to work better if we humanize technology and we make sure we include all humans. So thank you again to Open Business Council, to Anne that was supporting us, and Seraphima that was supporting us in the background, and Hilton and Dennis and we and Rachel. We all appreciate being here. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you, Ivo.